He didn't lead with a crown. He led with silence. This is the untold cinematic story of Ibrahim Traoré, the president who chose humility over power and built a revolution that outlived his own name. No speeches, no soldiers, just dignity, dust, and a nation that remembered how to stand. If you think leadership means control, think again. Before we begin, tell us this in the comments. What does real leadership mean to you? And if you believe silent revolutions are the ones that last, hit subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. The city of Ouagadougou stirred to life under a haze of early morning gold, its skyline bathed in soft sunlight that gently painted the rusted rooftops and awakened the dust-filled air with a sleepy shimmer. But inside the presidential palace, no light could pierce the weight in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's chest as he sat alone long before dawn at his desk that had become less a seat of power and more a place of reflection, burden, and silent wars. Outside, the hum of motorbikes and the chatter of vendors preparing their morning stalls was faint but growing. The sounds of a country that was trying to live, breathe, and survive despite the undertones of tension that had been crawling like cracks beneath the floor of his administration. And Ibrahim, in his simple dark tunic with sleeves rolled high on his forearms, looked down at the confidential file in front of him as though it were a memory, not a report. Pages filled with intercepted communications, grainy surveillance images, and, most painfully, a name he never thought he'd see there. Amadou Diallo, his childhood friend, his brother in arms, his moral mirror during the revolution, now apparently the orchestrator of a brewing coup that, if left unchecked, could unravel every fragile strand of hope they had fought for. The room smelled of old wood and fresh ink, and a single fly buzzed near the windowsill, ignored entirely by Ibrahim, whose world had narrowed down to that one page, that one name, and the impossible weight of betrayal it carried. Because Amadou wasn't just anyone. He was the boy who shared his mangoes during the hunger seasons, the young man who stood in front of soldiers and told them to lower their rifles, the same man Ibrahim had appointed to a senior government, all because he believed, perhaps naively, that shared dreams never die. But the evidence was irrefutable, the tone in the intercepted voice message clinical and cold, the plan disturbingly precise. And when Marie, his most trusted aide, entered with a pale face and a sealed brown envelope, her eyes already confirming what he feared, Ibrahim didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even breathe for a moment as she placed the envelope down and said in a quiet, trembling voice, "Mr. President, this came through the internal route. It's been double confirmed." And the silence that followed her words was so thick it could have choked the room. Ibrahim picked up the envelope, tore the seal without ceremony, and stared at a list of names that were more than names. They were histories, ghosts, futures dangling in peril. And there it was again, circled in red. Amadou Diallo, with meeting locations, delegate logs, and regional recruitment charts, tying him directly to seditious movements building momentum in the western provinces. And even though his heart screamed that it must be a mistake, his eyes knew better, and so did the ache in his chest that no steel will could suppress. And when Marie asked, "Should I alert internal security?" Ibrahim finally spoke, "No." His voice like stone softened by wind. "I'll go myself," which startled her so much she actually stepped back. But he stood calmly, closing the file like a chapter that could not be rewritten, and within an hour, without a convoy, without a single security vehicle, just a plain car and a single change of clothes, he left the capital alone, driving westward through the waking countryside, past roadside vendors, setting up their wares, and barefoot children kicking dust in alleys. His thoughts louder than the engine as he replayed every conversation he'd had with Amadou over the years, trying to trace the moment their dreams had diverged into betrayal, if betrayal it truly was. The road was long and cracked, and the sun climbed slowly over the horizon, like a spotlight on a stage he hadn't rehearsed for. And when he finally reached the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso, the air was drier, heavier, and filled with the scent of earth just before a storm. He followed the location in the dossier to a modest home near a dried-out riverbed where the trees stood twisted and tired. And when he knocked on the door, there was a silence so long it almost felt deliberate before the knob turned and Amadou himself stood there, thinner than he remembered, eyes sunken not from guilt, but from years of some silent war within. And neither of them spoke for a long moment until Ibrahim said simply, "I need to talk." And Amadou, after only the briefest hesitation, nodded and stepped aside. The inside of the house was humble. A single fan turning above a table that still held a half-eaten loaf of bread and a bottle of lukewarm water. And on the walls were photos, grainy, sun-bleached, and all too familiar. The two of them as boys, as fighters, as brothers in dreams. And when they finally sat, Amadou poured water into 2 glasses with a hand that didn't shake. And Ibrahim looked at him, not like a president confronting a traitor, but like a man staring into a mirror that had cracked. And finally he said, "Why?" One word, not an accusation, but a bleeding, raw question that carried years of hope inside it. And Amadou's response came not as an excuse or a denial, but as a confession. "Because the people are starving, and I didn't know how else, to make you see it." And Ibrahim closed his eyes, not in anger, but in sorrow, because he had seen it every day, but didn't know that others no longer believed he had. And what followed was not a shouting match or an ultimatum, but a conversation held in the low, aching tones of men who once promised never to become what they had now become. Powerful, distanced, and alone. And when Ibrahim left the house, he didn't order Amadou's arrest, didn't summon backup, didn't even leave behind a threat. He simply said, "You have one night. If you want war, I'll return with it. If you want redemption, you'll meet me tomorrow at the old school where it all began." And as he drove away, the sky above Bobo grew darker with clouds, the kind that gather before the sky splits open. And inside the city, word began to spread quietly that something rare had happened. The president had come not to punish, but to listen. And that night, as the rain began to fall in slow, thoughtful drops, Ibrahim sat alone in a cheap guest house room, listening to the water tap against the window, as if the heavens themselves were asking, "What kind of man will you be tomorrow?" And he had no answer yet, only a decision waiting on the other side of sunrise. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind the scent of wet soil and broken tension, and as the clouds pulled back from the sky like curtains lifting before a silent act, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the gates of their old school, the place where revolutions were first whispered between classroom walls and scratched onto the backs of notebooks hidden from colonial-era teachers who warned them that dreaming too loud was dangerous. And he waited, not as a president, but as a man who refused to believe that brotherhood died with disagreement, his hands in his coat pockets, breath visible in the chilled morning air, heart beating against the same ribs that once housed courage too big for their young chests. And then he saw him, Amadou, walking slowly down the dirt path. No guards, no fanfare, just a man who had come not to reclaim power, but maybe to reclaim a part of himself that had wandered off in the name of urgency. And when they stepped inside, the crumbling schoolhouse, the broken chalkboards and rusted desks bore silent witness to the reunion. And Amadou sat on a bench they had once carved their names into, looking not at Ibrahim, but at the place where their initials still faintly remained, IT plus AD, a rebuild, and he exhaled like a man releasing a decade's worth of guilt. "You still remember that?" And Ibrahim nodded, sitting beside him. "I never forgot." And that's when Amadou pulled from his bag a stack of documents. Not weapons, not demands, but proposals. handwritten plans for rural water systems, education platforms, food redistribution, ideas, things he had tried to implement quietly before the bureaucracy crushed them, and his voice cracked as he admitted, "I started organizing not because I wanted your seat, but because I thought you had forgotten the seat we were trying to build for the people." And Ibrahim didn't speak at first, only read, line by line, watching the ink that had come. From frustration and love spill across the page, and when he looked up there were no tears, just resolve. Then let's fix what we both broke. And from that hour, something changed. Not in law, not yet in policy, but in the soul of the leadership. And together they returned to the capital, quietly, while the country still slept under grey skies and uncertain headlines. And within hours, Ibrahim called a closed session in the palace, a room filled with generals, ministers, judges, and veterans. And when Amadou walked in behind him, the tension was instant, necks craned, eyes narrowed, hands twitching. But Ibrahim raised one hand and said, "He came back to build, not to betray," and then laid the documents before them. Not as a proposal, but as a challenge. If we claim to serve the people, prove it. These are their ideas. Fund them, test them, or admit we never truly cared. And silence followed, long and stiff, until finally the Minister of Agriculture stood and said, "We start tomorrow." And just like that, with no applause, no parade, no press release, the quietest revolution in Burkina Faso began. Not with gunfire or protests, but with reluctant nods and the shuffle of old men gathering courage once more. And over the next several days, Ibrahim and Amadou traveled village to village, unveiling a new kind of governance, listening camps where elders and children sat in circles with ministers and soldiers, sharing pain and plans alike. And in one village, a young girl named Tida handed Ibrahim a letter she had written in pencil. "On recycled paper, my mama says we don't need promises. We need presence." And Ibrahim carried that letter in his pocket for weeks, reading it before every speech. And when critics began to whisper again, calling it performative, weak, naive, he responded not with press statements but with action. When the clinics reopened in Zorgo, he worked a night shift in one. When grain reserves were distributed in Sicily, he lifted the sacks himself. And all the while, Amadou stayed close but quiet, choosing not to reclaim power, but to help those who never had it in the first place. And though not everyone believed their truce was real, something undeniable was happening. The villages that once whispered rebellion now hummed with construction noise. Classrooms once empty echoed with voices again. And for the first time in years, mothers stopped boiling bark for dinner and started planting hope instead. And one evening, as the sun fell behind the mosque towers of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim stood on a makeshift stage and spoke without script. "If leadership is only measured by how many enemies we silence, then I have failed. But if it's measured by how many voices we raise, then I ask you, raise yours now." And the crowd, once quiet, once cynical, rose to their feet, not chanting slogans, but singing old lullabies their grandmothers taught them. And it sounded like healing, like the return of something ancient and sacred and far from the stage. Beneath the branches of a neem tree, Amadou wept quietly, not for redemption, but for the rarest kind of forgiveness, the one that never comes with words, only with shared work. And as night blanketed the capital, Marie found Ibrahim sitting alone once more in the garden, letter from Tida in one hand, cup of tea in the other, eyes fixed on the stars that flickered like echoes of every soul who once believed in something better. And she asked softly, "Was it worth the risk?" And he answered, not with certainty but with honesty, "I don't know. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm not leading from above. I'm walking with them." And she smiled, because that was all she had hoped to hear. And in the darkness, a candle flickered in a window across the city. Then another, until from the sky, Ouagadougou glowed not with electricity, but with belief, quiet, steady, and burning through the silence like a vow finally remembered. The days that followed were marked by a rhythm no headline could capture. A quiet revolution measured not in parades or treaties, but in calloused hands shaking dusty tools, in elderly women teaching letters under neem trees, in the hesitant laughter of children rediscovering books that didn't just talk about the past, but dared to speak about a future they might actually be part of. And while Ouagadougou returned to its pulse, a slow dance of traffic, street vendors, ministry cars, barefoot runners chasing errands through alleyways, the spirit of the nation had subtly changed, as if something ancient beneath its cracked roads and forgotten buildings had been stirred awake. And Ibrahim Traoré could feel it, not through poll numbers or press reports, but in the eyes of strangers who no longer looked at him like a distant emblem on a poster, but as someone they had met, someone they could argue with and still trust. And he welcomed it, even when it unsettled. His own routines, even when it forced him to revisit parts of himself he had long buried under policy and protocol. One such moment came on the third Monday of the new initiative cycle, when Ibrahim visited Bondouille, his birthplace, the village where he and Amadou had learned to fight without fists, where resistance had grown from whispered prayers and shared bread. And as his motorcade entered the familiar dusty path that led to the heart of the settlement, he asked the driver to stop and stepped out alone, wanting to walk the rest of the way with the dust in his shoes, to remember the path not as a leader, but as a son of the soil. And the villagers, recognizing him despite the absence of guards, gathered slowly, not out of obligation but curiosity. And when an old man with a bent cane and cataract-clouded eyes reached out and touched Ibrahim's face with a trembling hand, he whispered, "Still breathing? Then you still belong." And those 5 words humbled him more than any award ever could. They spent the afternoon gathered in a wide circle beneath the only surviving baobab tree, the same one Ibrahim had once fallen from while trying to hang a homemade flag during their early days of rebellion. And as the wind rustled its wide leaves, stories flowed like water through cracked hands. Stories of fields lost to erosion, of daughters walking miles for water, of fathers gone to gold mines that ate men whole and never spat them back. And Ibrahim didn't speak for hours, just listened, nodding, asking questions, writing down names and suggestions on a small leather-bound notebook Marie had gifted him months ago. And it wasn't until the sun had started to lean westward that he stood and said, "We talk of policies and programs, but today I want to ask you this. What would you do if no one stopped you? If no government limited you, what would you build?" And the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was fertile. And when it finally broke, it was with the voice of a woman named Bintu, who had been silent the entire afternoon, sitting cross-legged. Near the back, her arms wrapped around a woven basket of dried millet. She said, "I would teach the girls how to farm, not just how to plant, but how to sell, how to save, how to own." And then another voice added, "I would reopen the broken clinic, even if all I have is herbs and soap." And another, "I would start a school with shade and silence and a bell that doesn't ring like a factory." And Ibrahim, listening, smiled, not because these were utopian dreams, but because they were so painfully real, so immediately possible, and yet ignored for decades in favor of louder, shinier plans that lined foreign pockets and never reached the ground. And as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows behind them, he stood and said, "Then let's do all 3 before the month ends." And that's how the Bondouille pilot began. A government-funded, locally-led micro-program designed not by consultants in suits, but by people with cracked heels and straight backs. And its results in just 12 days would silence many of his fiercest critics. Though he didn't do it for their silence, he did it for the night he would lie in bed weeks later and finally sleep without dreams of failure. Meanwhile, back in the capital, whispers of a new resistance began to reappear. This time not from soldiers or foreign spies, but from within Parliament itself. where some lawmakers who had grown fat on years of stagnation saw Ibrahim's approach as not just a threat to their power, but an exposure of their irrelevance. And while they didn't wear uniforms or issue manifestos, their weapon was subtler. Legislative gridlock, manipulated narratives, and strategic budget refusals disguised as procedural caution. And Marie, ever alert, brought this to his attention one evening as they walked through the garden behind the palace, where jasmine grew wildly and the night buzzed with unseen crickets. And she said, "You are building with your hands, but they're unbuilding with theirs." And Ibrahim, staring up at the stars that had once guided him across deserts, replied, "Then we build faster than they can tear." And so he called a national address, not from the golden steps of the palace, but from a circular village hut in Bondouille, with elders sitting beside him and children in the background painting new classroom walls. And he spoke simply, clearly, "Change is not a file on a desk. It is a wall repaired by your brother, a midwife delivering your cousin's child, a daughter who walks to school because her father stayed and didn't flee to Europe. That is what we are protecting, not my title, not their threats, but your lives." And the broadcast, carried on radio waves and cell phone live streams, echoed across Burkina Faso's dusty fields and urban sprawl like a drumbeat that said, "Wake up, your story is being rewritten with your own ink this time." And the people heard it, loud and unfiltered, and the effects were immediate. More letters from villages offering blueprints, more volunteers joining the Bondouille model, more youth stepping up not for office but for ownership. And as the momentum built, Ibrahim knew they had crossed an invisible line, that point in every movement where going back was no longer an option. Not because of pride, but because the people now expected progress to look like them, smell like their food, sound like their music, not like promises imported in cardboard boxes. Then came the moment that would test him more than any coup threat or budget sabotage. An assassination attempt, not from a sniper or foreign drone, but from within, in the form of a gift sent by a trusted economic advisor, a box of imported chocolates laced with a neurotoxin nearly undetectable by standard screening. Discovered only by accident when Marie, allergic to dairy, insisted the sweets be rechecked by the kitchen staff, and when the lab confirmed the presence of the compound, Ibrahim's hands didn't shake, but his eyes narrowed in a way they hadn't since the coup that first brought him to power, and he called no press conference, issued no decree. He simply summoned the advisor privately, placed the poisoned box between them, and said, "You almost killed more than a man. You almost killed what we're becoming." And the advisor, cornered, collapsed into tears, claiming blackmail, threats, desperation. And Ibrahim, exhausted but resolute, didn't jail him, didn't banish him. He reassigned him, not as a punishment, but as a reckoning, placing him at the head of a rural waste management program in a village that had never known the color of clean water. And when Marie asked later, "Was that wise?" he replied, "Redemption must be more than a sermon." And with that, the palace gates opened wider and the movement deepened, not higher but downward, like roots finding water in a cracked world. The days that followed the poisoning incident were a blur of decisions, not of panic but of precision, as Ibrahim Traoré doubled down not with retaliation but with acceleration, launching a second pilot initiative that became known as the Mirror Village Program, in which each major ministry was tasked to shadow a rural district for 90 days, not with bureaucratic oversight, but with full immersion, sending actual policymakers to live, sleep, and work in the areas their policies impacted most. A bold move that drew mockery from career diplomats who scoffed at the idea of ministers tilling land. But that very visual, a defense minister harvesting cassava beside a woman who had buried 2 sons in the last drought, quickly silenced the laughter and captured the attention of regional media outlets who began calling it the Burkinabe inversion, where leadership no longer meant distance but proximity, and while urban elites bristled, the countryside roared in approval, for the first time feeling not visited but seen. And as the program gained momentum, Ibrahim's own, days became an unbroken chain of movement. He slept less, spoke more, and began insisting that all internal meetings include at least one citizen from a district without reliable electricity, as a living reminder that theory divorced from reality was nothing but noise. And Marie, watching him navigate this self-chosen storm, began to worry. Not for his safety this time, but for his soul, wondering silently how much of himself he was willing to give before he collapsed under the very change he was building. And one evening, after a particularly grueling listening session in a village struck by seasonal flooding, she found him alone beneath an acacia tree, hands buried in the mud where a family's home had once stood, just sitting there, silent. The sunset bleeding around him like a wound, and when she sat beside him, he finally spoke. "Do you think they'll remember the mistakes too? Or just the miracles?" And she replied gently, "The people remember who stays after the cameras leave, that's all." And that seemed to steady him, for the next day he stood before a gathering of regional governors and announced a nationwide challenge that stunned even his closest allies. A full decentralization experiment, temporarily transferring key decision-making powers on education, agriculture, and small-scale finance to 15 rural communes for a 90-day cycle, with a live broadcast dashboard tracking success stories and failures in real time, creating not only transparency, but local accountability. A concept so radical that even international observers began arriving just to understand the mechanics. And amidst this whirlwind of innovation, something deeply personal was unfolding in the background. Ibrahim had received a letter from his estranged uncle, Yacouba, a former revolutionary who had disappeared decades ago after the fall of the Sankara era, believed dead or exiled, but who now wrote from a small hut near the border of Mali, saying simply, "You've done what I didn't have the courage to finish. If you come, I'll explain everything." And so, one early dawn, with no ceremony or escort, Ibrahim drove north across cracked terrain and winding dust roads, passing cattle herders and distant mosque towers until he reached a tiny compound, where an old man with wild eyes and a long grey beard opened the door and embraced him like no time had passed. And for the next 6 hours they spoke, not of politics, but of spirit, of betrayal within the revolution, of hidden truths, of brothers turned to enemies, and enemies who had once shared mangoes as boys. And Ibrahim learned things that broke his heart, about backdoor arms deals, about compromised ideals, about moments when his own father had refused to follow orders that would have made him rich but crushed their people. And as the sun began to set, Yacouba placed a small wooden sculpture in his hand, a faded carving of a lion and a dove, saying, "Power is not choosing between them, it's carrying both without killing either." And Ibrahim returned to Ouagadougou heavier than he'd left, not with despair, but with inheritance. And it changed something in him, made him slower in speech but sharper in action. And that week, when a foreign energy company attempted to bypass community protocols for a mining deal, he not only revoked their license, but made the hearing public, forcing the executives to answer directly to the families whose lands they'd tried to claim. And when a journalist later asked him why he risked so much political capital on such small communities, he replied, "Because that land has names, and those names built the house I live in." And the answer, clipped and unscripted, went viral across Africa and beyond, sparking a continent-wide conversation about extractive justice and ethical leadership. And soon, letters began pouring in from other leaders, some thanking him, others warning him. But one, from a young Ghanaian mayor, simply said, "We didn't know we were allowed to lead like this. and that one moved Ibrahim more than all the others combined. Meanwhile, Amadou, working deep in the countryside, had grown quieter but wiser, using his new assignment to not only repair damaged trust, but to explore an entirely new model of rural cooperatives, ones that prioritized dignity over charity, where villages managed their own inventory and decided their own prices. And when Ibrahim visited one of these co-ops unannounced, he found Amadou teaching a group of teenagers how to negotiate contracts with city vendors, laughing and gesturing with the same fire he had used in the protests years before. And later that evening, as they sat by a fire drinking millet beer, Amadou asked, "Do you still dream of escape?" And Ibrahim replied, "No, now I dream of return." And they clinked their cups in the flickering dark, and in that small exchange was buried the secret of why the quiet revolution had worked thus far, because it wasn't about heroes or perfection, but about returning to what was forgotten and refusing to leave again, no matter how hard the road. And as the next phase of programs rolled out, ones involving radio-powered distance education, eco-brick housing, and maternal health networks run entirely by local midwives, the people responded not with praise, but with participation, which Ibrahim called the highest form of applause. And in the palace garden one night, watching the moon rise over the faint outlines of a nation still struggling but no longer alone, Marie turned to him and asked, "Do you ever miss the old you?" And he smiled, eyes reflecting the stars. "Only when I forget why I left him behind." And they sat there a while longer, two souls in the middle of something enormous and delicate, knowing tomorrow would bring fresh battles, new betrayals, and endless fatigue, but also knowing this truth. Beneath the dust, the roots were holding strong, and that was enough for now. There are moments in every revolution when silence becomes heavier than gunfire, when the absence of noise is not peace, but the winding up of something unsaid, and Ibrahim Traoré began to feel that silence creeping through the palace halls like a slow flood, cold and invisible, seeping through marble cracks and whispered meetings, through side glances in briefings and paused sentences over lunch. And he knew it wasn't fear anymore. It was doubt, not from the people outside, but from those inside, the very officials who had once rallied behind his fire, who now, in the comfort of his early success, had begun questioning whether this much decentralization, this much humility, this much power in the hands of peasants was sustainable or even safe. And it became clear during one cabinet meeting in particular, when Minister Sanogo of National Infrastructure, a man known more for his suits than his work, stood and asked in his careful, rehearsed tone, "Mr. President, do you believe emotion has a place in national budgeting?" And Ibrahim, who had just returned from helping villagers dig irrigation channels with their bare hands, looked him in the eye and replied, "I believe if a child dies from thirst while we debate budget tables, the problem is not emotion, it's detachment." And while the room fell quiet, Sanogo smiled slightly, the kind of smile used by men who know they've just planted seeds of rebellion, not with weapons, but with condescension. And after that, things shifted subtly. Emails delayed, projects slowed, language in briefings changed from "we" to "your initiative." And Ibrahim, ever perceptive, began reading more between lines than within them. And it broke something in him. Not anger, but a deep fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from watching people you once believed in quietly exit the truth while still standing in the same room. He didn't confront them, not yet, but he started disappearing more often, retreating into the countryside, to schools and clinics and farmlands where the work was slower, simpler, and reminded him why he started in the first place. And it was during one such visit to the province of Banfora that he met Lamine, a boy no older than 12, who approached him barefoot and dusty, holding a worn book in one hand and a hand-carved toy plane in the other. And when Ibrahim crouched to his level and asked, "Where do you fly that?" the boy replied, "In my mind, because the sky costs too much here." And something in that answer lodged itself inside Ibrahim like a stone under the skin, and he decided on the spot to launch a new education initiative, not just about literacy, but about dream literacy. Programs that taught children how to build futures with the materials they had, not the ones they waited for. And within weeks, solar-powered learning pods began appearing in villages, stocked with offline content in native languages, run by trained locals, and powered by community councils who decided their own curriculum pacing. And the result was immediate and electric. Parents who once feared education would alienate their children now saw them returning home teaching elders how to use a touch screen or read medicine labels, and the joy was real, contagious, undeniable. But in the capital, resistance was hardening like wet cement, and Marie brought him disturbing intel. Private dinners among ministers, conversations with foreign business liaisons, coded memos requesting oversight reviews. All signs of an impending internal coup, not with guns, but with procedure. And while Ibrahim felt no fear, he felt sorrow, because he knew what this meant. Another test, another weight to carry, and this time it wouldn't be solved by a single speech or a viral photograph. And so he did something unexpected. He invited Sanogo and his allies to a weekend summit, not at the palace, but in a converted school in Djibo, one of the poorest and most underserved regions in the nation. And he brought no media, no security theater, only an invitation, and a single line printed on each seat: "Come touch what you decide." And for 3 days, the ministers were made to walk the same routes villagers took to get water, to sit in uncooled rooms as community leaders explained exactly how policy trickled or didn't into their lives. And on the final night, over a meal of plain rice and goat stew, served without plates on banana leaves, one of the younger ministers, a quiet man from Toma, stood and said, "I thought governance was strategy. I was wrong. It's proximity." And for the first time, Ibrahim saw flickers of change in the eyes of those who had once only seen numbers. And when they returned to the capital, a quiet purge began, not through firings, but through exposure, with departments required to publish weekly transparent logs of every expense, every contract, every delay and corruption. Long a silent partner in state operations began gasping like a fish on a hot plate. And while this earned Ibrahim both admiration and enmity from across the continent, he pressed on, because by now the real threat was not failure, it was erosion, the slow return of cynicism that could hollow out everything they had built. And one night during a press conference, after yet another infrastructure delay traced back to a bureaucratic blockade, a journalist asked, "Do you feel betrayed by your own team?" And Ibrahim, tired but still fierce, answered, "No. Betrayal requires surprise. I am only disappointed by how many choose comfort over change." And the quote hit headlines across the continent like a lightning bolt, triggering debates in universities and newsrooms from Senegal to South Africa. And though some called it arrogant, most called it necessary, and the ripple effect was enormous. More youth-run oversight committees, more whistleblowers stepping forward, and more ordinary citizens recording town hall meetings with their phones and uploading them to national portals, creating an organic network of accountability that even Ibrahim hadn't fully planned for. And in the middle of all this fire, he found a strange kind of peace, not from victory, but from rhythm, from knowing that each time the system pushed back, the people pushed harder. And one morning, walking through a rural medical post freshly stocked by an initiative funded through citizen micro-donations, he saw a young nurse teaching elders how to read prescriptions, and he asked her, "Why are you here instead of in the city?" And she replied, "Because here they look me in the eye when they say thank you." And it reminded him again that leadership was never a place. It was a practice, a posture, a decision repeated every day in 1,000 quiet ways. And as dusk fell that evening, and the hills of the south glowed red with firelight and sunset, Ibrahim stood alone watching smoke rise from the chimneys of homes that now had light, and whispered to the night, "I'll carry this until my back breaks, but I will not put it down." And somewhere beyond the trees, a drum began to beat, not for war but for work. By the time the leaves began to change their whisper in the Sahel winds, shifting from the brittle crispness of dry heat to the soft rustle of a coming storm, Ibrahim Traoré could feel a deeper tremor, one not in the earth, but in the walls, of governance, where cracks no blueprint could predict were beginning to appear, not in public, not in protest, but in the kind of silences that follow long meetings, where no one makes eye contact. In the carefully sanitized language of ministry reports that somehow said everything and nothing at once. In the sudden appearance of health concerns from ministers who no longer showed up to rural shadow assignments. And most of all, in the way Marie, always steady, now paused before speaking when bringing him new intelligence. The tipping point arrived with a single photograph, slipped under his office door without note, just a high-resolution image of 3 men seated in a French hotel lounge, one of them Sanogo, the other a foreign ambassador, the third a corporate executive linked to energy contracts previously blocked by Ibrahim's land reform policies. And though no timestamp accompanied the photo, the implication was enough to spark 1,000 questions and only one answer. Something was being planned. Far from the dust and dignity of the people, something polished in marble halls with whispers and wine glasses, and so he didn't react, not immediately. He watched, waited, listened, and when the next cabinet meeting was called, he opened with a line that stunned the room. "If I were to be removed next week, what part of our work would still live without me?" And the silence that followed was heavy, not just with confusion, but with shame, because somewhere they had forgotten that the revolution was never supposed to be about a man. It was supposed to be about a mirror. And in that silence, he laid out a proposal that none of them expected. The launch of a national continuity charter, a binding multi-sectoral framework that would transfer key leadership decisions to rotating citizen councils if the executive branch were ever compromised, voluntarily diluting his own power in a way so radical that even his international supporters hesitated, unsure whether to call it brilliance or political suicide. But Ibrahim didn't care about optics. He cared about ownership. And as the Charter was drafted, debated, and then finally signed into law under the title Eco Governance Act, he stood on the steps of the Parliament, not in uniform, not behind a podium, just holding the hand of a young girl from the Bondouille pilot program who had been orphaned by a flood and now ran her village's food bank. And he said, "If I fall, she will rise." And the message rang clear. This was no longer a state with a hero. It was a movement with a future, and yet, as expected, the resistance sharpened, because systems do not yield without fight. And soon the rumors began. Radio shows seeded with doubt, social media posts from anonymous sources alleging inflation cover-ups, even whispers that Ibrahim's father had once sold secrets to a foreign government, a lie so blatant it insulted even his enemies, but damaging enough that it spread. And in the middle of all this, Marie fell ill, not from politics, but from sheer exhaustion, her body finally rebelling after months of sleepless nights. And for the first time in their years together, Ibrahim sat beside her bedside with nothing to say, just holding her hand, watching the IV drip as though it contained not just medicine, but borrowed time. And when she woke, pale but smiling, she whispered, "I'm not leaving you alone in this." And he replied, "You never have." And when she returned to work days later, slower but no less fierce, the movement felt stronger. Again, grounded in something more than policy. It was love, in the quiet form of loyalty, the kind that survives disillusionment. And then, just as the political machine began to rear its head again in the form of a surprise no-confidence motion disguised as a budget revision, something unexpected happened. A group of market women from Ouagadougou marched to the capital, not with protest signs, but with receipts, actual printed records of how Ibrahim's rural programs had raised their income, slashed their transport costs, increased school attendance for their children, and they camped outside Parliament singing songs older than the Constitution. And when security hesitated, unsure whether to disperse them or document them, Ibrahim walked out and joined them, sitting cross-legged on the pavement, eating cassava from a communal bowl as journalists from 5 countries captured the moment live. And when asked what he was doing, he replied, waiting for leadership to return to its roots. And within 72 hours, the no-confidence maneuver collapsed. Not from negotiation, but from exposure, and the ministers who had authored it were quietly reassigned or resigned, some out of shame, others because they simply could no longer pretend the people weren't watching. And in the aftermath, Ibrahim called for something unprecedented, a national week of pause, where government offices remained open, but all major decisions were frozen, allowing every department, community, and ministry to reflect publicly on what had been built, what had failed, and what must come next. And during that week, he visited every province on a tight, exhausting tour that ended each day with open-air town halls where nothing was off-limits. And in one such gathering, in Ouagadougou, an old man stood up missing half his teeth and said, "You have made many mistakes, but you stayed. You listened. That's all we ever wanted." And Ibrahim, too tired to hide his emotions, just bowed his head and said, "Then I will keep staying." And somewhere in the crowd, Amadou clapped, his eyes wet, because they both knew this was the moment, the pivot, when leadership stopped being a title and became a burden freely chosen again and again. And by the end of the reflection week, the country was not healed, but it was aware. And in politics, awareness is fireproof. And so the next stage began, institutional legacy, training a generation of mid-level leaders to carry the philosophy beyond the man, creating academies for servant governance, rotating fellowships in conflict resolution, and the elevation of what came to be known as the listening culture, a model of governance that had begun with a walk in the dust and now echoed in academic journals and conference halls far beyond Burkina Faso. And late one night, after returning from a final session in the north, Ibrahim stood alone in the presidential garden, the jasmine in full bloom, and wrote in his notebook a single line, "I'm no longer afraid of being forgotten, only of being misunderstood." And beneath it, he signed not his name, but the phrase the children had begun using in chalk murals across villages. Papa Faso, not a title of power, but a name of care. And in that name was buried every scar, every forgiveness, every risk, and taken without a guarantee. And as the wind carried petals through the air, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Let the next storm come. I am ready." There is a strange loneliness that comes not when you are abandoned, but when you are celebrated for something you no longer recognize in yourself. And for Ibrahim Traoré, that loneliness settled into his bones like a quiet ache the moment international praise began replacing the raw, unfiltered voices of the people he had once walked among barefoot. Headlines from Paris, Nairobi, São Paulo, and New York began to crown him with titles he never asked for. The dust-born Democrat, the Shepherd of Sahel, Africa's Quiet Thunder. And each new headline made him flinch slightly, not because he feared scrutiny, but because praise often came with expectations shaped by people who had never watched a grandmother pour her entire harvest into a school fund, or seen a boy walk 6 miles to borrow a pencil. Invitations from global forums flooded his inbox, from TED to the UN General Assembly. And while Marie encouraged selective engagement, suggesting they could leverage visibility to secure better international trade terms or debt relief, Ibrahim hesitated, not out of arrogance but out of caution, for he knew that visibility was a kind of currency that once spent could not be reclaimed. And so he sent a single video address to the Global South Summit, recorded not in his office but under a tree in Bondouille, where goats wandered in the background and village kids giggled off camera. And in it, he spoke not about geopolitics, but about rhythm, saying, "Before we measure progress in GDP, let us measure how many elders sleep without fear." And the simplicity of the statement broke through the jargon-drenched conference halls, sparking both admiration and cynicism. Some called it poetic, others naive, but none could ignore it. And yet, as global attention swelled, a quieter crisis began to take shape within the very heart of the movement. The idealism that had birthed 1,000 village projects was beginning to splinter under the weight of scale, as newer officials, drawn to the banner of People First, began treating the brand as a shortcut to legitimacy, not as a philosophy of humility. And Ibrahim noticed the signs, policy drafts that cited slogans but lacked substance, community, reports doctored for optics, field visits announced instead of undertaken. And when he confronted a junior official about faking photos of a clinic repair, the young man looked confused and said, "But sir, I thought they just needed hope." And that, more than the lie, devastated Ibrahim, because he realized the danger wasn't betrayal. It was dilution, the slow fading of intent into performance. And so he did what few leaders ever do. He paused everything, announced a 30-day recalibration period where no new initiatives would be launched, and all departments were required to return to the last 5 communities they served, not to evaluate impact, but to ask forgiveness. And across the country, civil servants, some proudly, some sheepishly, stood before citizens and said, "We thought we helped, but did we listen?" And the responses were mixed but honest. And something rare happened. Trust deepened, not because perfection was proven, but because accountability was practiced. And during that period, Ibrahim vanished from the public eye, retreating to a mountain village known only to a handful of childhood friends, where he chopped wood in silence, prayed with farmers at dawn, and refused all devices except for a single radio tuned to local frequencies. And one morning, while walking through the fog-drenched hills, he found a boy carving birds into a tree and asked, "Why birds?" And the boy said, "Because they fly, but they always return." And Ibrahim smiled, because in that line he heard both a warning and a promise. When he returned to the capital at the end of the month, his beard a little longer, his eyes a little deeper, the entire cabinet stood to greet him, not out of protocol, but reverence. And he told them simply, "Now we begin again." And the second phase of the movement launched not with fanfare, but with the unveiling of the Listening Bill, a legislative framework that made it mandatory for every policy to go through public forums and response summaries before becoming law, giving villagers, students, and laborers a legal voice in lawmaking. And while some foreign observers criticized it as populist drift, others hailed it as the future of democratic resilience. But Ibrahim didn't care for the categories. He only cared that when he walked through the dusty courtyards of rural provinces now, elders greeted him with updates instead of prayers, and children showed him water pumps instead of petitions. And it was in one of those dusty courtyards that he received the news that shook him in a way no coup, threat, or slander ever had. His mother, long silent and distant after his rise to power, had died in her sleep, her body discovered by a neighbor who came to deliver porridge and found instead a quiet finality. And Ibrahim froze, standing beneath a neem tree with dust on his boots and sweat on his brow, and whispered only, "I never showed her the clinic." And Marie, who had been with him through every fire and flood, reached out but didn't speak, just stood beside him as the sky slowly darkened. And the next day, the capital held no procession, No military salute, only a small convoy carrying Ibrahim and 3 siblings to a clay brick cemetery on the edge of the Sahel, where they buried her beside her husband, whose grave bore a single sentence carved by Ibrahim's hands years before. He planted what he never saw grow, and now he wept not as a president but as a son, not for loss but for delay. And that night, back in the palace, he wrote the final clause to the listening bill by hand. No voice is ever too late, and signed it with a drop of water from the desert's last storm. The days following his mother's burial passed not in grief, but in an eerie clarity, as if her absence had cleared a window in Ibrahim Traoré's soul, allowing him to see not just what he was building, but the invisible shadows of what it was costing him. And in that sudden light, he saw the fatigue in Marie's eyes as she read through midnight reports, the hesitation in Amadou's voice when asked to lead yet another community summit, the slow but steady quietness settling across his team like ash after a fire. None of it dramatic, none of it disloyal. Just the natural gravity of human beings trying to carry something that had outgrown even their original ambition. And one night, as Ibrahim stared at the unfinished outline of a national cultural preservation project, he found himself scribbling, then crossing out, then scribbling again, until finally he wrote a single phrase in the margin. If the revolution kills its messengers, it forgets its message. That line stayed with him for days, echoing louder than even the chants of school children or the sound of construction at new hospitals. And so he decided, against every political instinct, to begin transferring visible power, not through dismissal or abdication, but through diffusion, launching what would become known as the Pillar Transition. A structured public platform where regional citizens could elect local reformists to temporarily replace national directors and ministers in short-term stints, a kind of honorary infiltration designed not just to democratize governance, but to disrupt the professionalization of detachment. And the move, announced through a handwritten letter read live on rural radio stations by local storytellers, shook the nation, not because it was radical, but because it was intimate. And in that intimacy, something sacred stirred again. Grandmothers debating land use laws with MPs, market women rewriting food transport policy, disabled youth co-authoring infrastructure, plans for cities that had never built with ramps. And across every region, people didn't just engage, they showed up, not as angry mobs, but as architects who had been waiting decades to be invited into the room where their roofs leaked. And yet, as the movement deepened, so did resistance from outside the country. Investment banks began to threaten credit downgrades, diplomatic cables leaked accusations of instability, masked as inclusion. And one prominent Western analyst wrote, "Traoré governs like a poet in a war zone," a line that trended online for days until Ibrahim himself responded in a press statement that simply read, "Then may every battlefield bloom." And the world didn't know how to handle a leader who replied to geopolitical cynicism with metaphors rooted in soil and sweat. But the people of Burkina Faso did. They painted murals of flowers on checkpoints and gates, wrote the phrase on school walls, sang it during marches, and somehow, what had started as insult became anthem, and that anthem traveled, not just through Sahelian wind, but across borders, Ghana, Mali, Senegal, even Brazil and parts of Indonesia, where youth-led collectives began quoting Traoré in climate protests, and urban housing movements, calling him the soft-spoken storm. And this global echo caught Ibrahim off guard. Not because he didn't believe in the message, but because he had never intended to lead anything beyond the land he could touch. And now he found his words shaping dialogues he would never hear. And that reality brought him to a moment of quiet, surrender, one he experienced during an unplanned visit to a silent monastery deep in the cliffs of the Leraba province, where he stayed for 3 days without speech, eating plain porridge and rising with monks at 4 a.m., just to learn how to listen without preparing to respond. And on the second night, beneath a sky so cloudless it felt like a ceiling of stars, one old monk asked him, "Do you fear failing your people?" And Ibrahim replied, "No, I fear becoming their cage." And the monk nodded, placing a seed in his hand and saying, "Then be the soil instead." And Ibrahim wept, because for once he understood, not every leader must be the tree. Some must become the ground that lets others grow. And when he returned to Ouagadougou, he was different, not weaker, not smaller, but clearer, and he gave his first address in weeks at a school courtyard where desks were still made of painted scrap. Wood, and he said, "I cannot promise I will not fall, but I can promise that if I do, you'll already know how to rise." And with that, he launched the last great phase of his presidency, not a policy, not a bill, but a mindset he called the disappearing hand, where success would no longer be measured by applause but by absence, by how little his involvement was needed to keep justice breathing. And it began immediately, with village energy co-ops run entirely by youth councils, maternal health networks coordinated by retired midwives, land records managed by farmers themselves. And over time, Ibrahim began stepping back, not from accountability, but from centrality, teaching instead of directing, mentoring instead of mandating. And as the new year approached, a journalist asked him during a quiet interview, "Do you still consider yourself the leader of this revolution?" And he looked up with soft eyes and said, "No, I consider myself its echo." And somewhere, in a quiet village where no one had electricity, but everyone had dignity, a child wrote in chalk on the back of an old school wall, "Real power is the hand you no longer need to hold." By the time the rains returned to the Sahel with their slow, drumming persistence, bringing green back to the cracked fields and coaxing forgotten seeds into trembling sprouts, Ibrahim Traoré had begun to feel the weight of his body in ways he never allowed himself to before, not in dramatic collapses or urgent hospital visits, but in the subtle quiets. How long it took him now to rise from a chair, how even his silences carried fatigue rather than focus, how the pages of his speeches grew shorter, not because his thoughts had shrunk, but because he had begun speaking more with presence than with prose. And perhaps, he thought one afternoon, as he stood watching a boy in Ouagadougou balance books on his head while carrying water to his mother, this is what wisdom looks like. Not knowing more, but needing less. And it was in that spirit that he began preparing what he never publicly called a transition, but what Marie, who by now could read him better than any strategist, named quietly, in her own notebook, the slow goodbye. And though no one spoke of illness, everyone noticed the shift. Ibrahim no longer sat at the center of every reform council, no longer responded personally to every village letter, and instead began inviting midwives, elders, and children to lead parts of national addresses, sometimes even letting them stand at the podium while he sat among the crowd, applauding. And in those moments, when a 10-year-old girl recited land reform goals or a blind grandfather spoke of justice, the people didn't cheer louder. They fell into a deeper silence, the kind only stirred by truth too big for celebration. And yet outside the country, as news of Burkina Faso's continued transformation spread, free elections run by citizens' assemblies, a universal soil bank, water equity councils run by widows, the pressure to turn Traoré into a global icon intensified. His face appeared on murals in Accra, his quotes printed on protest banners in São Paulo, his image projected behind panels in Davos, where men in suits debated whether humility was scalable. And when he was invited to accept a Global Peace Award, he declined, sending instead a recording of an old woman shelling peanuts while humming, with a caption that read, "Peace does not arrive on a stage, it is carried in hands like hers." And the video, just 38 seconds long, was viewed by over 70 million people in a week, sparking both praise and backlash. But Ibrahim remained unmoved. walking barefoot through rice paddies one day, sitting in silence beside a grieving father the next, still hosting dusk meetings by lantern light in forgotten towns, where the sound of goats braying often overpowered the sound of official dialogue. And it was during one such village visit that he collapsed, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, sitting beneath a fig tree after a long walk, simply laying his head back against the bark and closing his eyes. And when Marie, alerted by a young girl who had brought him water, arrived minutes later, she found him breathing slow and shallow, lips slightly parted, the dust on his boots undisturbed. And she knew it was time to stop pretending he was invincible, and he was moved immediately to the best rural clinic they had, one he had personally helped establish. And as the news spread across the country, something strange happened. Not panic, not chaos, but stillness. As if the nation itself held its breath and the markets quieted, the radios lowered, the cities slowed their rush. And in villages and towns, people gathered not to mourn, but to wait, sitting together in fields and courtyards, lighting fires, cooking simple food, telling stories, some true, some myth, of what they had seen him do. Of how he once carried a bag of millet 5 kilometers because a farmer's donkey had died. Of how he once stayed an extra day in a village just to help rebuild a wall. Of how he remembered names, all of them. And even now, in the clinic where he lay resting, he was heard mumbling them. Names of children, of martyrs, of midwives, of schools, as if his mind, even in fever, refused to let go of the people it carried. And for 5 days, he drifted between lucidity and sleep. And on the 6th, when Marie came to check on him and found his eyes open, she smiled and whispered, "You scared everyone." And he replied, hoarse but smiling, "That's how you know they're ready." And that night, against every doctor's order, he asked to be wheeled outside and under the stars, wrapped in a kente cloth. He looked up and said, "If I die, don't bury me as a leader, bury me as a listener." And Marie, fighting tears, nodded but said, "You're not dying." And he smiled again, "Then let me rest like I am." And in that silence, as a warm wind blew dust across the open plain, a group of children appeared carrying a small chalkboard, and on it they had written, "We are still listening." And in that moment, beneath that sky, Ibrahim closed his eyes, not from pain, but from peace, because the echo had taken root, and whether his body held or failed, the voice no longer belonged to him. The morning that followed his final night beneath the stars arrived like a whisper rather than a trumpet. No alarms, no morning bells, just a slow bloom of sunlight over the clinic rooftop, spilling into windows and washing gently across Ibrahim Traoré's face as he lay resting, not unconscious, not fading, but held in a stillness so complete it resembled peace. And Marie, seated beside him, her eyes swollen with sleeplessness but bright with something unbreakable, knew in her gut that something irreversible had occurred. Not death, not yet, but a crossing. And when Ibrahim finally opened his eyes just past dawn and looked at her with a gaze so soft it seemed made of smoke, he said nothing, only reached for her hand and gave it one firm squeeze as if to say, "It's time." And she nodded, because she too had been preparing, not for his absence, but for the permanence of what he had built. And so, while the doctors tended to his body, while his strength returned in small, uneven waves, the nation began its quiet transformation, not with a headline or decree, but with small things. A shoemaker in Tenkodogo, adding a sign that read, "Built by clean hands." A teenage girl in Zinyare teaching elders to type in Mure. A former rebel commander in the north planting trees in silence. Each act not coordinated or commanded, but echoing, living, inherited, and in the capital, the listening councils expanded their meetings, now joined by young officials who had never met Ibrahim in person, but quoted him fluently, not out of hero worship, but because his words had taken root in their daily vocabulary, like water absorbed by soil so thirsty it could remember every drop. And in that remembrance, something holy was born. Not a regime, not a movement, but a way of being, a governance not imposed but grown. And though foreign observers still debated his methods, labeled him a populist prophet or a poetic anomaly, the people stopped listening to the world's categories and instead started naming seasons after him. The planting rain that comes too early but feeds the desperate ground they now called the Traoré cloud. And in cemeteries, women began burying their dead with seeds tucked beside them, whispering, "Grow what we couldn't finish." And though Ibrahim was never told this directly, he heard it in the tone of village radio hosts who read poems between crop forecasts, in the way market stalls now displayed handwritten messages instead of printed advertisements, in the young children drawing maps of Burkina Faso, where borders didn't just mark territory, but dreams. And one evening, when he had grown strong enough to walk again without assistance, Ibrahim stood on the back veranda of the palace, not as a man in power, but as a man letting go of it. And he watched the wind rustle the leaves of the neem trees he had planted on his first day in office, now tall and firm and sheltering birds who sang in languages no law would ever capture. And he said quietly to no one in particular, "Let them take the shade, not the tree." And he smiled, because he knew the tree didn't belong to him anyway. And so began the final phase. Not a resignation, not an abdication, but a soft shift into presence without control, where Ibrahim no longer signed decrees, but sent handwritten letters to regions, thanking them for making decisions he once feared to delegate, where he stopped giving speeches and instead listened to them, often sitting anonymously among audiences, letting new voices rise unshaped by his guidance. And when asked by a foreign journalist whether he worried about misinterpretation, about the erosion of the original vision, he replied, "Everything erodes, except intention." And as the years passed, Ibrahim became less a president and more a parable, a name spoken not at rallies, but at bedsides, a story told by fathers to sons when teaching the value of listening before speaking. And one day, without fanfare, he stopped appearing in public altogether, choosing instead to travel with no security, no announcements, just showing up at bus stops, food stalls, and funerals, saying little, but being seen. And when rumors began that he had died, they were met not with panic, but with quiet affirmation. If he has, then he lives in what's around us and in a small rural town. Years later, a child visited a community hall and saw a portrait of him beside a faded chalkboard with the words still scrawled in white dust. "Real power is the hand you no longer need to hold." And the child, not knowing history, but feeling something ancient, turned to a teacher and asked, "Was he the president?" And the teacher smiled and replied, "No, he was the wind that helped us remember how to walk." And far away, beneath a fig tree now overgrown with wildflowers, a man in a worn coat, older and smaller than his legend, knelt in the dirt and helped a young boy mend a broken bicycle, spoke, saying only, "Let's make sure it carries you forward," because that was always the point. Not that they remembered him, but that they kept moving together in the direction of dignity, in the name of silence that once became a voice and then became a country.